I have complicated feelings about Ghost in the Shell. The new live-action remake, I mean. My feelings about the original film are very uncomplicated. I love it unconditionally. It's a great movie. But the remake, on the one hand, it's an ambitious, technically impressive cyberpunk thriller, which is something that I really want to see more of from Hollywood. On the other, it's dumb as a sack of fucking bricks, and it's basically an insult to the original movie. But before I get into that, let's take a step back and talk about my perspective on the film going into its release. The original Ghost in the Shell is an important film, and for once I'm not just speaking personally when I say that. The Matrix and Dark City would not exist without Mamoru Oshii's original vision of Neo Tokyo, and without them we wouldn't have, well, half of all modern action movies and all of modern cyberpunk film. So Paramount's new remake isn't just another case of Hollywood taking something beloved within the anime community and potentially ruining it. It's a case of Hollywood remaking a vital part of the film canon. This film filled me with the same trepidation as the upcoming sequel to Blade Runner and the abysmal PG-13 remake of RoboCop. That last point of comparison will become much more relevant as this video goes on. This remake had so much to live up to, and given Hollywood's lack of respect for foreign films in general and animation in particular, there was little reason to believe that it would even come close. The original movie is smart and nuanced. It approaches transhumanism and the loss of self as not being inherently negative, and I had strong doubts that that spirit could carry over to a film made in America, a nation that fetishizes individualism and frequently rejects scientific progress.
See this, America? You see this? Look at this. I can pay for stuff by slapping my credit card on the machine. This is the future, America. Wake up, America.
Sir, your card has been declined.
Oh. Guess I gotta make more SAO videos.
And then there was the whole whitewashing issue, which I have complicated feelings about as well. I think that if you're transporting a film setting to the United States, then it makes sense to cast American actors in the principal roles. And when you consider that the US is 64% non-Hispanic white and only 5% Asian, that means that you're gonna be casting white people as anime characters. And you'll probably end up casting more black and Hispanic actors ahead of Japanese ones as well. That's just how the demographics in the US break down. Of course, that should mean that 1 in 20 blockbuster movies have Asian leads, and we're not even close to that, but I don't think it's right to blame an individual movie for a shitty trend. But that argument only makes sense if your movie is set in the United States. If your movie is set in, say, Japan, a country whose genetic makeup is almost 100% Japanese, then it would be a little weird for your lead, who is supposed to be a native citizen of Japan, to be white. Oh. Whoops. Ghost in the Shell as a property cannot be taken out of Japan. The series' setting is inextricably tied to Japan's history and uses that as a basis for speculation on its future. The existence of Section 9 really only makes sense in the entrenched bureaucracy of the Japanese Diet, and many of the series' characters have their roots in Japan's unique armed forces, the Self-Defense Force, which is not allowed to operate outside of Japan under a treaty with America. To move the film to America, you would need to throw out all of Masamune Shirow's world building in regards to geopolitics, economics, and 2 nuclear world wars that build on the legacy of the last Great War. You would essentially need to start from scratch, at which point, why take the license at all? So, Ghost in the Shell had to be set in Tokyo, but it also had to star Scarlett Johansson. I get that. The way that Hollywood currently works, you can't justify making a movie of this scope without a big lead at the helm. And there are no Asian actresses who do action movies and have anywhere near the same name cachet as ScarJo. I mean, everybody really wants Rinko Kikuchi to be a big star, but until we're calling her Ringcooch, which maybe I should rethink that, it's not going to happen. And there's this whole other infinitely circular argument about whether or not that's because Hollywood never gives those actresses a chance in the first place, but I'm not going to get into that here. I'm barely equipped to handle it. I understand the argument for why this movie needed to have a star of ScarJo's stature in order to sell it, although apparently that didn't help to sell it too well. But I can see very few scenarios in which that wouldn't negatively impact my personal suspension of disbelief while watching the film. Going into it, the only scenario that I could think of that even kind of worked, that Motoko Kusanagi chose to have a white cyber body as a fashion statement, I guess, only raised more uncomfortable implications. Fortunately, the movie finds an alternate solution to that casting issue, one that actually does make sense within the film's universe. Unfortunately, the plot that justifies that solution turns this movie into a total betrayal of everything the original film stood for. One of the really interesting things about the anime Ghost in the Shell, which makes it stand out from other sci-fi action movies, is that the Major, Motoko Kusanagi, is not special, at least not externally. Her exterior appearance is a mass-production cyborg shell that can be found all over the place in Tokyo, even in storefronts as a mannequin. Full-body cyborgs aren't especially common in this world, but they're normalized to at least the same degree as people in wheelchairs or the blind. And at the point that the story begins, humanity has already accepted the idea of a mind totally decoupled from the body, a ghost separate from its shell. And the film raises an important related question. Where does that leave AI in the spectrum between robot and humanity? It also creates an interesting conundrum for Kusanagi. Can she really be sure that she's a human in the first place? We see in the film that memories can easily be rewritten, so maybe she was built as an android and implanted with false memories of a human life. Seeing identical mass-production copies of herself wandering around Tokyo only exacerbates that concern. This is what makes the Major an interesting, if not necessarily relatable, character. The nature of her existence both in and out of the context of the world around her raises all these different philosophical questions that will only become more relevant as technology advances. That's not the case with this new movie. They throw out much of what makes the Major interesting in favor of trying to make her more conventionally rounded and appealing to a contemporary audience. And to be fair, this character is a lot easier to relate to on an emotional level, owing in no small part, I'll admit, to Scarlett Johansson's brilliant performance. But she's not really the Major. Not even in name only for most of the movie. The movie focuses on the origin of the Major, here named Mira Killian. After an accident on a refugee boat, her mind was salvaged by Hanka Robotics and put into a robotic body, making her the world's first full-body cyborg. She's unique, special, and that makes her feel incredibly lonely, which I guess is as good a basis as any for a character, but it's not really Motoko Kusanagi. She's also obligated to serve in the government's Public Security Section 9 because the experiment that saved her life was part of a weapons program. She's not sure if she's even human or not, as she conveys in some painfully ham-fisted dialogue, and as she later finds out, her entire history was a lie. She was actually a teenage runaway picked up off the streets by Hanka Robotics, who are even more evil than it originally appeared they were, and turned into a cyborg against her will. Her original name, it turns out, was Motoko Kusanagi. She was originally Japanese, and the villains stole her identity, ethnicity included, from her. That's kind of interesting. It's about the most interesting thing you can possibly do with casting Scarlett Johansson in this role. You could use that as a strong metaphor for colonialism, or even Hollywood casting itself. There are a few problems with that, though. Firstly, the film just isn't smart enough to do anything with that idea. Instead of exploring the ramifications, it's just used as an excuse to cast ScarJo and still call the character Motoko Kusanagi. In fact, it almost seems like it was only written into the film in the first place because of the complaints. Because Bato is still white and still named Bato, and there's no similar justification for him. The bigger problem is that within the narrative, this ends up framing Motoko's transformation into a full-body cyborg as an inherently bad thing. Rather than being part of who she is, her cyberization becomes the ultimate violation of her privacy and bodily autonomy by an outside, corporate entity. Extrapolating from that, the underlying message of the movie seems to be that transhumanism is something that threatens our humanity rather than something that could possibly enhance it. That there should be a limit on how much we change ourselves using technology. The original Ghost in the Shell would never have made that kind of statement, and not just because Masamune Shirow seems to be genuinely excited by the possibilities of the technology that he's dreamed up. Ghost in the Shell doesn't give many definitive answers in general. It prefers to pose a question and let you reach your own conclusion, although admittedly those questions can be pretty leading. The original would never suggest that there's a simple answer to the big questions that it poses, especially not one as blisteringly stupid as, "It's not our memories that define us, but our actions," which more than 30 different people parrot at the camera over the course of the movie, and which only raises more questions if you think about it for even a moment. And I will ask those questions in a high-pitched voice because there's not enough tachikoma in either movie, and I need to make up for that. For starters, considering that everything we perceive is processed and stored in our short-term memory and we don't quite experience anything in real time, can you even make a meaningful distinction between our actions and the memories of them? And for that matter, aren't our actions in the present inextricably tied to our memories? The mind makes decisions by processing present stimuli in the context of past information, right? So aren't our memories and the way that we interpret them the cause of every action that we take in the present? That being the case, couldn't our actions be influenced by false memories? Not even the ones that are implanted by an outside source, but what about the memories that we alter by the very process of remembering them? Or dreams that we misremember as fact? Science suggests that our brains and the information contained within them are the sum total of who we are, so it stands to reason that changing or suppressing that information would at least partially change who a person is. We even saw that with the garbage man, who was presumably not a killer before Kuze implanted false memories within his brain. Actually, let's take a minute, or three, to talk about the movie's erstwhile villain, Kuze. Fans of Ghost in the Shell standalone complex will recognize that as the last name of Hideo Kuze, a JSDF soldier and full-body cyborg who attempts to assassinate Japan's prime minister as part of the Individual 11 attacks that form the main arc of the second gig. Which may be a little confusing since this movie is clearly doing the Puppet Master story from the original movie, right? Yeah, no, remember, this is Hollywood, so everything needs to be connected to everything else in the story, and having the villain be a random AI just wouldn't do. The movie still follows the story of Section 9 investigating a hacker who is using hacked androids and even hacked cybernetic humans to go on a crime spree. But now, instead of a rogue AI, the hacker is a failed full-body cyborg, Motoko's predecessor, enacting a campaign of revenge against the people who created them. Which I had figured out from Cutter's ridiculously evil little speech at the beginning of the film, and the fact that all of the targets were directly linked to the same company that built Motoko, not to mention that they more or less gave it away in the trailer. But this movie being predictable isn't the big problem here. The problem is that they took two really interesting characters, the Puppet Master and Hideo Kuze, and fused them into one boring, nonsensical mess. It makes sense that a sentient AI would be insanely good at hacking. It is a computer program, after all, many times smarter than a normal human. But a broken prototype cyborg? Even with the explanation that Kuze has built a neural network to enhance his processing power, I don't really buy it. Maybe my having seen the original film is just ruining this for me, but everything that Kuze does seems like it should be beyond the reach of a normal human hacker. That's what makes the Puppet Master so dangerous in the original film. By ditching the idea of an AI as the villain and making Motoko's cyber prosthesis special, the remake all but abandons the underlying themes of the original, the question of what it is that makes us human and how our species can evolve. It gets even worse as the film wraps up, though. After fighting a think tank in a scene taken more or less directly from the original film, only without all of the symbolic destruction of the environment around them, Motoko and Kuze lie broken and waiting for death in the middle of the street. Kuze asks Motoko to merge her mind into his neural network, and she rejects the offer because she'd rather die than lose her individuality, which is really about as far from the nuanced ending of the original film as you can possibly get. In fact, it's almost a straight-up middle finger to anyone who was hoping that the film might respect its source material. The ending of the original movie, where Motoko merges her mind with the AI to create a new being in order to save her life, is smart and thought-provoking, but it makes writing a sequel with the same star-studded cast difficult, to say the least. Ghost in the Shell Innocence had to change its focus to a new protagonist, and American audiences are way too dumb to follow something like that, so the studio's solution is to dumb everything down and change the ending to something more open-ended and philosophically meaningless. And of course, when you change the ending of something, you have to change the whole structure to make that work, so Ghost in the Shell ends up falling back to the old go-to approach for Hollywood adaptations of strange, interesting foreign films: awkwardly cram the source material into a blockbuster formula that seems kinda similar to it. The most hilarious example of this is Dragon Ball Evolution, which apparently was put into production after the studio read 3 words of the synopsis and said, yeah, we can turn this into the Karate Kid. But from turning Godzilla into a Roland Emmerich disaster movie to what they did to, like, every foreign horror movie adaptation that ever followed The Ring, you don't need to look far to find victims of this mentality. With Ghost in the Shell, I imagine that the studio conversation went something like this. Okay, so we've got the rights to this landmark cyberpunk movie. It's about this cyborg who fights crime with... So it's RoboCop? Well, no, she's a lady, and RoboCop with tits? We can sell 1 million tickets to that. Well, I mean, RoboCop is more of a critique of fascism, whereas Ghost in the Shell... Ah, thanks, I was just about to ask you for the title. You're welcome, but Ghost in the Shell has a more positive outlook on the future that... too late to change anything, bucko. I've already written the script. Now get making this movie. I want it out in like 3 months. So instead of doing, well, anything interesting, the film follows the same tired, betrayed super soldier plot that you've seen 1 million times by now in films and especially video games, which, beyond the problems that it poses for the underlying themes of the film, is just plain boring. Which is perhaps the most damning aspect of this movie. For all the visual spectacle, the fantastic score and sound direction, and the strong performances across the board, it's a total snooze fest. You can predict what's going to happen from the very first scene, and if you've seen the anime, then you already know what's coming in all of its big set-piece moments and fights. Ghost in the Shell does a lot to insult its audience and the fans of the original property, but the biggest insult is that it's such a huge waste of time. If you're not a super fan of Ghost in the Shell, the original anime, it's not even worth getting mad about. It's just another paint-by-numbers Hollywood vehicle with some directorial flourishes and a brain-dead script. It's a pretty shell with no ghost. I'd tell you to spend your money on something else, but the only other option is Boss Baby, and apparently that's already crushing gits at the box office, which I think says a lot. I've got a What's in an OP for Ghost in the Shell coming up in the next few weeks, as well as a ton of other videos, so be sure to hit subscribe if you want to catch all of that. And if you want to help me make even more great anime content, consider supporting me via Patreon like the lovely people whose names you're seeing right now. If you want to hear me talk some more about American adaptations of anime, then click right here for my defense of the upcoming Netflix Death Note, and leave some comments down below to let me know what other anime movies you would like to see me cover. Or you can click down here for a list of 5 great science fiction anime that I think you should check out. For now though, I'm Jeff Thu, professional shitbag, signing out from Neo Tokyo.